But I'd like to start now. First of all, as you know from the last session, we worked with Tina Rosenberg of Solutions Journalism Network to talk about how some of the really good stories can be crafted and framed to deal with um, youth justice, and we're going to try to apply the same metric, I guess, if you can call it that, to stories about COVID and the pandemic. And to lead us in that conversation, really delighted to have Mark Obbie, who is a contributing editor of the Crime Report, as well as all the other things he does. Long veteran journalist. So I'm going to start with Mark, and you can sort of take us into the question, and then we'll open it up to everybody else. Mark, over to you.
Thank you, and it's good to see my old friends here. I don't want to repeat too much general information about Solutions Journalism Network if the same people here have already seen Tina's
We
talk.
have new people as well. So
Okay, I'll keep it fairly brief, and I'm going to share my screen. Mostly, what I'm going to do is talk stories. I'm going to look at some stories that I have copied out of our Solutions Story Tracker. I know a couple of the people on the list of today's attendees are familiar with this because they already have stories in the story tracker. I noticed Ted Elkhorn and Claire Goforth on the list, and I have added personally their stories to our tracker. I'm the criminal justice specialist at Solutions Journalism Network, and our mission is to elevate this kind of reporting. You know, we as journalists are really good at spotting problems and telling which systems have broken down. But the purpose of Solutions Journalism Network is to train journalists and to spotlight this kind of work that shows where things are working, what is working, how is it working, and why aren't other places doing the things that work. So it isn't just happy news about somebody who found the secret sauce. We have topic specialists who vet these stories by hand. We have more than 10,000 stories in our tracker, but each one of them has been vetted by the specialists, and what we're looking for is a focus on the response, not just a mention at the end of the story that, oh, by the way, there are ways to do this, but an actual response that is working. There's evidence that it's working. It's not just an idea. These are not just think tank ideas, but actual programs, actual initiatives that have evidence that they are effective. The insights that we provide are really lessons for other places, other similar programs and people who need to learn what works and what has been used in other places. And because this is real journalism and not just happy news, not just fluff pieces, we expect and require that each story about a successful response talk about the drawbacks. What do we not know? What hasn't worked as planned? What did they learn from previous failures? So these are real stories about these programs. The tracker is a search engine that I think is a great way for reporters to look for story ideas. You can sort by location, by journalist name. You can of course, by issue, by the topics, but searching for stories on your particular issue before you start Googling generally, before you start talking to experts. It's by the way a great way to spot who are the experts, where are the studies that I can source for my own stories. When you submit your own stories, we on the staff are out there looking for these things all the time, but we hope and expect that journalists themselves will submit their own stories. You hit the screen when you start to submit, and it's a screening device to try to remind people that there are a lot of requirements for these stories to make it into the tracker. It's not just a bunch of ideas. About half the stories that are submitted are rejected because they fail on one of those pillars, one of those criteria that I just mentioned. So it's pretty rigorous. So once you're in once you're in the search engine, you've really got a lot of quality stories about effective, impressive programs. I went through, and Steve, stop me if you need to move on to the main Q&A. But I've got a bunch of stories that I found in my own searches, some of which I have vetted myself, some of which predate me. But I wanted to show examples of the kinds of stories that I'm talking about on the topic of COVID in jails and prisons. The FREEP had a focus on bail funds. I know you've talked about nonprofit bail funds when cash bail is still the order of the day, what can be done to get people out using donated money. But this also looked at the combination of bond reductions and administrative releases that have cut Wayne County, Michigan's jail population nearly in half. At the Star Tribune, another bail fund story, the Minnesota Freedom Fund had to improvise new rules for the coronavirus crisis. And it bears mentioning, notice the date here, March 27th, very early in the pandemic. As with any search engine, this is a snapshot in time. All the stories in here of things that worked might become things that don't work or that change, obviously. So in the case of this particular the Minnesota Freedom Fund, this is the one that was flooded with, I think, $30 million in donations after the George Floyd incident in Minneapolis and protests. So it's an example of jumping on a solution story as breaking news at the outset of a crisis. I don't know how long Andy Mannix, who has been to some of these John Jay seminars, I don't know how long he had to work on this, but it's not a big project. It's not something that he obviously spent months and months on, because we were really just learning about the pandemic in March. At Huffington Post, Ryan Riley has a story about an initial failure that turned around. Terminal Island Federal Prison near LA had one of the worst early stage outbreaks in the federal prison system, and officials responded with mandatory testing of all inmates and strict segregation of those who tested positive. This slowed the spread of the virus. And to show that this isn't just happy news or PR, the critics of the Bureau of Prisons, even early on in the crisis, had faulted it for not releasing more prisoners. This story doesn't ignore that, but its focus is on what did work. Are there things that actually could slow things down? I know we have some broadcast folks here. Yellowstone Public Radio in Montana reported on how the state's local jails rapidly shrank their populations. And so it really goes to one of the points that I think Chief Acevedo was just making in the previous session about how the improvisations that we're finding during the crisis can actually turn into long-term policy if we see what works, whether it's in Harris County or in Montana. So long-sought policy changes that could be enacted quickly without legislation are certainly opening people's eyes. And all of these stories are examples that you can use in stories about what is or isn't getting done in your own city or state. The Ohio Center for Journalism compared Ohio's much higher death count versus Pennsylvania's, and I realize this has changed since this story in August, but it examined how the two prison systems responded differently, and how Pennsylvania's would overcrowding and policies on early releases made its problems worse. I'm sorry, Ohio was the negative example here. We have an expression, well, not we, in social science, we have an expression about positive deviance, the outlier that shows that something can be done better than what everybody else is doing. And that's just a natural news story. And we've all done these stories or seen these stories, but Minneapolis is doing something right. Why isn't Milwaukee? This is, by the way, one of my favorite criminal justice podcasts of late, 70 Million. If you're not familiar with it, check it out. But they took on bail questions from another angle and explored the gray areas. Again, this isn't just about finding a magic bullet. This isn't about how everything is wonderful. This is a really nuanced story that just spends most of its time in the gray areas, talking about how early releases have not solved the underlying problems. It takes a critical look at risk assessment tools and what is or isn't working, what is or isn't fair, and really took a really complicated look at public safety and the balance of public safety and due process and public health, how that's all playing out in two systems in South Florida. So, this is in-depth, this can be and should be in-depth reporting that isn't trying to sugarcoat things. It's just showing that there are ways to think about these problems that isn't just showing, well, look how horrible everything is. I realize that I'm skewing a bit toward the nonprofit world here in my journalism examples. That's not really the case. We have mostly mainstream commercial news outlets in our database, but for these examples, I was finding good ones in the nonprofit world. New Mexico in depth, how state and local coordination lowered the jail population by 1/3 in 11 weeks, preventing widespread illness and causing law enforcement officials to question, why are we locking so many people up in the first place? So these questions are being asked and, if not answered, around the country, but in the immediate crisis, they're seeing effects, at least at the outset. This was June 1st. Just a couple more here. Talk Poverty is talking about a crisis phone line for LGBTQ inmates, providing emotional support during isolation in jail without outside contact. But it's also the system that they found was a form of accountability, because inmates were telling tales about what was really happening inside prisons and jails, and the word was getting out in ways that it wouldn't have otherwise. Next to last, we have the Marshall Project. This really focused on a real strong narrative about two people, a reformer and a sheriff in Tyler, Texas, who had formed this unlikely relationship, tense though it may have been, to try to figure out how to handle the pandemic and how to reform the jail in the context of the pandemic. So, this is a great news feature. It isn't strictly about policy. It is really about two people. So good journalism that can plug into this approach from many different angles. And finally, Reasons to Be Cheerful, which, to be honest, I kind of hate the name because it sounds like, nice stories about kittens and dolphins, but it's the David Byrne Project, he of the Talking Heads, and it does some actual serious reporting about serious policy subjects. This was about how Rikers like rushes to release jail inmates in cities nationwide seem to be the big breakthrough that reformers have been urging for so long. And the question explored effectively in the story is how city jails, through bail reform and lighter sentences, can make these changes permanent while ensuring public safety. So I'm going to leave it at that for now, the examples. I can go into some more details about what kinds of stories do and don't make the grade, but I'm going to stop it there.
Thank you, Mark. I mean, these are really super useful. I think if anybody wants to see links to those individual stories, I think we have them either in your PowerPoint, or maybe you could send them separately so people.
Yeah, I'll have to send them separately.
Okay, well, we can do that. But let me just take off from some of the things you said, Mark. Most of us know, I think, if you've been in journalism, for any length of time, we have the instincts and the reflex skills to go after what we think is wrong and what's bad with the system. That's what investigative reporting is usually about. But to look at something in a proactive way, the kinds of ways that you're talking about, takes some different skills and different techniques and different, I guess, reflexes that you need. So I'm wondering, what sorts of things you think we need to do, or reporters need to do, to think in terms of being proactive, in terms of finding out what's been going right in an individual situation. One thing that occurs to me, and I flagged one of the stories you mentioned, is the comparative element. If you look at how different cities and different jurisdictions do differently, and some do it more successfully others than others. I mean, that's always a very good way of pointing to people who've actually solved problems. And we don't do, I think, as journalists in the U.S. and really many other places, enough of that kind of comparative reporting or joint reporting. And it's always been something that I've called for, is that journalists work together across jurisdictions and across outlets to join up in following up on things that are working in one place and not working in other, and
Yeah, and
translating ideas.
if you think about it, that's really some of the best kind of accountability journalism you could do, because you're holding
Right.
your local officials' feet to the fire. You're saying, well, this isn't just an idea that some academic had. This is actually working in a comparable city.
Right.
Why aren't you doing this?
How do you follow up on these, though? I mean, so, we found out something's gone right. Someone's found a solution. What's the next step? I mean, we're talking about driving policy change, and it's, the ultimate takeaway that we'd like to see from good reporting. Where do you take it from there? Do you take it to the local mayor and say, look at our story, what are you going to do about it? Or how proactive should you be? How aggressive should you be in taking these solution stories to the next step?
Well, since you're reporting on an actual solution, something that's being used, that is actually working to some extent, you already have taken that next step. I mean, most investigative reporting is about the problem, and then at the end of the story they say, well, maybe there are ways to do this. This expert says XYZ about a way to solve this problem. That's so speculative that those stories often do end with a shrug. I've done many of them myself, where people say, well, what was the impact? And it's like, I hope people read it. I don't know. But the real impact in these solution stories is that, well, it's working, and we'll stay on top of it. If it's local, we'll follow it and see if it's continued to work. If it gets formal evaluations, we'll see what those say. I mean, there are sort of much more natural kinds of follow-ups to do with a story about an actual working program as opposed to an idea.
So I noticed that there's some questions in our Q&A section. They seem to have disappeared, but there's one back again. There's Chandra Bazilko on the line. Chandra, can we ask you to put your question live if you're willing? If you are, we can move to your and give you access by audio. If you could do that, Chris, to Chandra Bazilko.
She's there.
You should be able to talk now.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Chandra,
Can you hear
put
me?
your video on if you'd like us to see you as well.
Yes. I don't see where to put the video on, but
All right, we'll go for it with audio. That's fine, as long as we can hear you.
actually has nothing to do directly with criminal justice. But the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel switched from running op-eds and opinion journalism to more solutions journalism. I think it was late last year. And I wondered what you thought the contours are between opinion journalism and solutions journalism, since both kind of envision a better world or have a solution within them.
It's an interesting question.
Mm-hmm. I'll take a stab at that first. When we're vetting these stories for the story tracker, we often have this debate about, what do you do with expert commentary that has some actual reporting in it? We're not trying to be the journalism police and strictly define who is a journalist and what counts as journalism. So there are commentaries by social scientists, by activists, as long as they hit those pillars, as long as they describe what the limitations are, they show what the actual evidence is, not just a wish list, but actual results. Then those sorts of things may count. We give them a harder time, because if somebody's an advocate and they're pushing an idea, then we're immediately suspicious, because that it's PR. And if anybody has a direct connection to a particular program and they're writing about it themselves, then that's automatically rejected, because it isn't objective enough. But we do blur the line, because in real life, good stuff appears on the op-ed pages. In fact, Solutions Journalism Network itself was formed 7 years ago as an outgrowth from a New York Times column called Fixes, which still runs. and it's run with an opinion label, even though it's reporting. A lot of papers slap that label on guest written pieces that have a point of view, but I think hybrids are welcome.
Thank you.
Oh, yes, go ahead. Katti, was that you wanted to comment, or is that Chandra?
There's a second question from Ronald Burler.
Yeah, Ron, can we put you on screen with your audio? Okay, let's do that. Chris, can you raise?
He's being promoted. Yeah, it just takes a minute.
Okay, there he is. Such is technology. Ron, your audio is muted.
He had a comment more than a question, and I said it was a question, but he may want to weigh in on the comment.
Well, that's fine. I mean, I actually would be interested in hearing some of the experiences, like some of you all have been dealing with.
Am I there?
Yes.
Ronald, you are there. Sure, go ahead.
Okay. So my thought in the past, and particularly on articles that deal with criminal justice, is that I have emailed those articles to the chiefs of staff of every state legislator, and every congressperson where that issue applies. And you would be surprised how rapidly and how largely you get responses from these people, and particularly in this area, because it is one of the few issues that crosses party lines. So if you want to get read by a legislator or by a congressperson, I found that to be very effective.
Comments?
Isn't that what we all do when we're tweeting out our stories too? I mean, we're trying to get more mileage out of our stories, and if you tag, I've done this on my own stories, I've tagged interested organizations, whether or not they were in the story, just to make sure they see it and hope that they will retweet it, share it on LinkedIn or whatever. But we're in this business to make a difference and to have our stories read and viewed by the people who care about it. So that wasn't my dog, by the way.
It's mine.
Okay. So I think I have never done exactly what you're describing, but I think it's a great idea, and I don't see that it crosses any lines, if that's the question.
So, in previous sessions, people we've had on have been academics or specialists, some impacted folks. But today's session, we were talking to people on the front lines, the corrections workers and law enforcement. And, once you get below the level of chief or corrections chief or union official, it's very, very hard to get them to sit down and speak frankly. And so it's even much harder further to even think about applying a solutions journalism metric to those folks. And I wonder, first of all, what you might have to think about that, Mark or Katti, and also if anybody else wants to share their experiences and where they've been successful at actually having that done.
Well, I don't know how public officials would react to the specific notion of solutions journalism. I don't have that much experience at talking to them about it.
We wouldn't tell them that's what it was.
Right. But the whole idea behind solutions journalism is that one of the reasons that the public is disenchanted with the work that we do is that we just heap problems on them and we make them feel hopeless. And there's some merit in that idea. Now, I'm a big believer in traditional investigative reporting. I fly the IRE flag proudly, but I get the IRE weekly newsletter about great stories that were done around the country, and it is great work, but every single one of them is a big problem that just is sitting there festering. And after a while, that really does wear people down. So our idea is that you have to do both. You have to cover, that's why we refer to the whole story. The whole story isn't just that things are screwed up, it's that some places are figuring out how to do it right. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I think that, people want to hear this sort of thing if it's smart, if it's done in a rigorous way, and it provides something other than just sheer.
But how do
dread.
we get at them? I mean, those people on the front lines are the hardest really to persuade, because they obviously distrust journalists, and distrust what we do with their stories and what we do with their experiences. Do you have any advice that you can give about if you're trying to approach, a cop who's been working, a 18-hour shift, dealing with COVID or dealing with, mental health issues? What would you do in terms of getting on their side to say, look, we'd like to tell people a little bit about what you've been dealing with? I mean, the chief, Art Acevedo, was pretty open today about the problems that they've had, and the fact, and so was Andy Potter, in fact, and the fact that nobody really listens to them.
Before Mark answers that, Steve, I actually wanted to add to what he was saying.
Yeah.
Both SPJ has a new endeavor called Journalist on Call, and the DeWitt Project, Media and Democracy, DeWitt Wallace Media and Democracy Project, go directly to these notions of trying to raise news media literacy by listening more to our audience and going directly to that point that Mark was talking about of not always having the naysayer bad news. I think that's critical to our work, as someone who is covering criminal justice and a lot on correctional health care and mental health in corrections. There are a wealth of stories out there of innovations that are born out of fiscal concern, desperation, overtaxed correctional workforce, all of that. But going to this idea of trying to, and these literacy projects are about reviving trust in the media. And so the work of that as journalists is largely on us. It's not sort of pandering. But I know for myself, especially in mid-COVID, there are days when I'm like, shit, can I get some good news, right? But I think that is so critical, and maybe especially critical if you are writing about criminal justice, because there is all this other work. And that work, I think, becomes an entry point into this correctional workforce that we say is that is unwilling to talk about us. If I am writing, for example, one of the panelists we had in Florida who is doing this amazing work to try to keep people who are mentally ill out of jail, training staff, training mental health peers. Like if we could do more of that work, it not only becomes the solution thing, but it's really hard and heavy journalism, right? You can talk empirically about what it means to match a mentally ill, formerly incarcerated person who's on their meds with somebody who's coming out. But if we really do care about craft and we really do care about the industry, we have to be mindful of the kinds of coverage that we're doing day in and day out. And I'm not right, but you asked your questions before I got to jump in. So
no, it's fine.
Yeah.
No, I agree with that. And to Steve's point about how do you get people to cooperate? I mean, if I understand the question, it's easier to get people to talk to you, to help tell their story about things that aren't just horrible, that are actually starting to work. I mean, I've done lots of stories on police departments that had terrible reputations, but that had turned things around to some extent. It wasn't a silver bullet, but it was progress. And if you tell them that that's what you want to write about, and that you're also going to write about what isn't going right and has to be tweaked, and why it was a big problem in the first place, you're going to be honest, but you also want to tell the story of how they're trying. It's about trying. Mm-hmm. Then I've gotten much more cooperation from police in particular, because they realize, well, first of all, because they really are trying in a lot of places. They aren't just on a rampage doing everything wrong on purpose. Mm-hmm. Some departments, violence prevention, for example, is my area. And, every time I tell somebody that that's what I write about, from the general public, they'll just roll their eyes and go, "Well, you got a lot to write about violence because everything's horrible." And it's like, well, you know what? Some things actually work, and some police departments really are figuring this out. COVID is new, so it's a little harder to have a track record. And some of the early successes, I'm sure, have fallen apart and have gone wrong. That's life. But when things do go well, and we can explain why they went well and how it was done correctly, at least to a point, then we're telling much more of the story than just the things are terrible.
I think linking COVID to the larger question about where the justice system is going and where it's heading is another part of the problem. We've been trying to do that a bit in this series, but I think that's a key part of, if we just talk about COVID in jails, who's going to get vaccinated, who's gotten sick, then we're probably not doing the complete job, because these are rooted in much larger problems that as a society we haven't yet really faced. But and when we have done these roundtables live, I usually go around the table and actually pick people, whether they like it or not, to say a few words about what they're thinking about. And so I'm going to exert that now. I wanted to get some comment from our broadcast members, and Nana Kari, who's there. I wonder, Nana, if you are still there, if you wouldn't mind giving us some of your experiences in trying to get, and not only to get to the stories kinds of stories we're talking about, but how you get people to speak. My God, I think she's just left. Just I saw her.
No, she's there. No.
There she is. Yes, Nana.
I got promoted to panelist.
Okay, Nana, I'm going to unmute you. Hi, Nana.
Maybe she is gone.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone.
Oh,
Yeah,
there.
there she is.
Y'all hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Oh, no.
Yes, we can.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. Steve, I'm sorry. Could you ask the question again?
Well, what experiences have you had as a broadcaster trying to get folks to talk to you, and in terms of how you would get to the kinds of stories that Mark has been talking about today, which are solutions oriented rather than just, what's wrong with the system, what's wrong with the problems. And if you've only got 2 minutes, to do or even less to do a story, it kind of limits you, doesn't it?
Yes. You know what? And actually working with Fox News Channel is a bit difficult because, but sometimes there's bias on it because of how we have branded ourselves as Fox News.
Nana, I think we're not hearing you correctly. Can you speak maybe into your mic? Is it just me?
No, it's a problem.
Sorry, I was trying to get the video on. I missed it. Do you hear me now?
Yes. No,
Do
I
you
take
hear
that.
me?
Yes.
You can. Yes.
Okay, awesome. No, I was saying that it's just sometimes folks being with Fox News Channel because we already know that we are going to probably turn things around the way we want it to be. Now, I should be honest, that's usually true. There are times where I'll write a story and I'm told by a copy editor to take some out just to fit our brand. So it depends on case by case basis. But overall, covering the pandemic, I've been on the pandemic and I was on the national protest. And it's like I said, it's being day by day, a case by case process. But I must also use this opportunity to say a very big thank you to all of you. I've learned so much that I've included that has added context to my script for air. And I can't thank you enough. This fellowship has been an awesome experience.
Thank you back.
Thank you, Nana. I want to go to Aaron Morrison to get the view of somebody who's in the wires and how difficult it is to, considering the kind of deadline a minute that you guys have got. How have you been experiencing this issue? I just unmuted you, Aaron, but I guess you're muted again. There you go. Aaron?
Sorry about that. I was not expecting you to come to me.
I know that's the surprise is the key.
Yes. And your question again is how I've been doing this work for the wire.
Right. What kinds of stories have you had in mind to do in terms of COVID and the pandemic, and taking in in mind what Mark is talking about, the solutions approach? You see
Right.
how you can approach, how can you use that or frame that for this kind of stories you're doing?
So one of what excited me most about this webinar series was that, you know, we talk so often about decarceration and you know what needs to happen so fewer people are in this sort of tinderbox of virus that can explode at any moment, and in a lot of cases has already exploded. But I was really concerned because I've visited prisons where I've seen some pretty remarkable work being done by the incarcerated folks to deal with underlying issues that got them there. And, you know, so a lot of these group work, I hate to use the term self-help, but, you know, those groups the group therapy that they participate in, programs that are sometimes supported by organizations on the outside. And, you know, immediately I wondered, well, you know, these amazing groups that I got a chance to witness, did those stop, you know, as a result of the pandemic?
That's a good story.
Could you not bring in, you know, the facilitators that were coming, you know, every week or every other week or monthly? Could you not bring them in anymore because of the pandemic? And what impact does that have on not just the psyche, mental health, and overall well-being of people who are living in these institutions, but also, you know, what impact will that have on recidivism? Because if you are able to come out of you're be able to be released on parole, a changed person as a result of some of the programs, though they are very few across most systems. If you're able to come out a changed person after having participated in some of those programs, I would imagine that sets a lot of people back if those programs completely go away. And maybe here I'm giving away my story idea, but that's something that I'm interested in measuring, actually, is to figure out what impact the pandemic has had on those programs, on, you know, the churches and the organizations that come regularly, what impact the pandemic has had on their ability to administer those services.
I mean, are there places where people have found workarounds or alternatives?
A lot of it is being done. A lot of it is being done by Zoom, just like we're doing here. Some of it has been done on phone. Sometimes they will pre-record programming that is then played, inside of a prison institution. So. Yeah, I mean that's sort of the workaround right now, as far as I know. I'm certain that, you know, religious services haven't completely stopped for prison systems, but you know, my idea is to just measure it. How can we measure it? Especially if I can bring data to bear around number of hours lost as a result of the pandemic on some of these programs.
I think it's a natural story. Obviously, I don't know who would be measuring it, but, you know, Prison Policy Initiative and others, I'm sure, are asking those questions. But, you know, you hinted at this, but, you know, the follow-up, the add-on to that is, well, how have the workarounds been done right, and what's worked? If you search the story tracker, there's a COVID tag called coping, how are systems and programs coping with COVID isolation, and you can blend that search with prisons and jails and see what you get. I don't know exactly what you get, but I know I've seen stories about ways to turn programs virtual, and the same is true for reentry programs once people are soon after they're released.
Great.
Yeah, I think reentry.
Andrea Collier is in the waiting room. Were you going to say that, Katti? Then
Aaron, I'll text Aaron. I'm going to email you privately. Okay.
Okay.
Andrea, I think you're in the waiting rooms. Did you want to say a few things?
It just happened to come. I don't know. It just happened to come on.
Well, you're there. You're there.
Well, one of the things that I'm going to be looking at is working on a larger project about collection of COVID data. And I get the impression, I mean, there are like 99 different bodies of folks who are working on this, but I have not heard them talk about collecting data on prisons and jails. And I'm going to ask the question, how would they go about getting that? Because if they are tracking African Americans, there's so many African Americans in the system, you're losing numbers by not tracking them. So, I mean, one of my questions and something in my story is going to be, why don't we care about these people? Why don't we care about what's happening there? And in the cases of jails and in prisons, they're going to come back into our communities sooner than later in many cases. So we don't have a goal point, a start point on that. So that's what I'm thinking about.
That's a great idea. I mean, are you looking at community groups and community services that are trying to deal with, because that's a whole unanswered question right now, is how you deal with people who are being released, because many of them end up being homeless, as you know, that they there's no places for them to go or shelters, and they're out there in the street, and there's no services out there, whether it's mental health services or addiction services or substance abuse services, and their health is impaired, and of course they're particularly vulnerable. I don't know, does anybody have any ideas about how to get at that story and find out who's helping them? Katti?
I mean, there are a whole slew of organizations, some of whom have been here on the ground that are as close to empirical as we can get. Emily Wong is co-founder of the Transitions Clinic Network.
Yes.
I think getting it, which has patient navigators who were formerly incarcerated. I mean, like some of this, as need be in the moment will just have to be anecdotal, but there are these efforts to collect at least some data, and some of our speakers have addressed that. I would go to them. I would look heavily at folks who are working in reentry, folks like Tommy Green, who was with us last week, the community health worker. I think it's sort of a back entrance into it, but I think many of the numbers will come out of that sort of reentry experience because they're easier numbers to get, and they will rely somewhat on just sort of what people testify to, what they say.
Maybe the Fortune Society also.
Right. Fortune Society, there's folks at Vera, the Transitions Network. I mean, there are a whole slew of folks that I can think of. And probably when we send out the experts list, probably should add some names of these organizations and contacts. So I'll expand the experts list.
Good idea.
To add
we'll post that online. I think the longer this goes on, the more institutionalized some of the support services and networks are or will be, and that's one of the key areas that's worth investigating, is the development of these new institutional networks that can help folks who coming out of
development of their, and some of them are new. So one of the big questions here, like if you talk to folks of color, particularly who are formerly incarcerated, but who also have master's degrees and PhDs, they will tell you about how white the space is of folks who run criminal justice, who are doing research in criminal justice. But there are folks who are not necessarily in the headlines, particularly if they happen to be formerly incarcerated and got a degree. I think they look at it in a different way. Some of those folks would be the people at Just Leadership USA, the folks at New Leadership, and I can't think of their whole name right now. But I think a lot of this is going to disproportionately the folks of color who have been behind bars, who are now working in this sphere, but who may not be at one of these legacy criminal justice agencies, who are overwhelmingly, as we even seen that, in the lineup here. Overwhelmingly, this is a white space. And I think there's a whole other conversation being had by people of color who either have been incarcerated themselves, who know people, and the same would go for poor folks who've been in this, who happen not to have been of color. I mean, those are sort of the marginalized voices, in the same way that Andy Potter has said, we don't bring corrections officers into this conversation enough. We also don't bring people immediately affected by this in enough. Those people, their families, their neighborhoods, you know, and I'm going to shut up now. A lot of the reentry work is being done by those very folks. So part of it is really getting to them.
We have another 5 minutes or so. We can keep going. If anybody else has any questions, or I can pick one of the folks. But Mark, did you want to say something? Do you want to comment on?
Can't improve on what Katti just did.
What she said, right?
Right.
Okay.
I want to go to Tom McMurrow. I see he's still on the line. So I saw Ted Alcorn there, but I think he's gone now. But I wanted to ask Tom for a comment from him. Tom, if you're still there.
He's on his way up.
Okay. Hey, Tom, I think you're on. Have we got him on? No.
You know,
Maybe-
this
Yeah,
is
go
a
ahead.
hard, go ahead.
He disappeared.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
Might be,
we lost him?
yeah.
Scaring people away.
I'm sorry
People
about
don't
that.
want to give away their stories. You know, I say this every time. I wouldn't
We
be,
always have that issue. There he is. There
I
he is.
wouldn't give my stories away.
He was upside down. There you are. Hi, Tom.
Hey, Tom.
Here. Hi. If I'd known I was going to be on, not the jersey, so don't tell anybody.
You didn't have to dress up for us.
This has been a great series. This really is. I really was fascinated with today's speakers. I think one thing that's very interesting. I was actually going to send an email about this, but Chief Acevedo makes a point that's like really kind of ironic and weird, but that you know, the Republican Party in the recent election successfully hung the mantle of defund the police on some Democrats, on some of their opponents, which was interesting. And yet, it is really the Republicans who will defund the police, as Acevedo pointed out. If Congress doesn't act and fund the states and fund the municipalities, help fund it because they can't run in the red, we will have to fire police. I mean, it's that simple. So I was fascinated because Acevedo kind of went down that road, and just to complete that thought, that really defunding the police. Well, if you don't want to defund the police, you better start funding the states, and you better start funding the municipalities. But I mean, there's so much to talk about with this whole series. You know, prison reform. I found the first speaker today fascinating in terms of, like, we don't think about it, but how the white working class essentially goes into becoming corrections officers, and a lot of these guys just want to do the right thing, and yet they're put in this, and they have no voice, as was pointed out. So there's so much here. This is such a great stew of stuff that we just have to enjoy and really start reporting on it.
Right. I'd like to maybe close, you know, by asking people what they got from that first speaker, from Andy Potter. I have to say, he's really singular. You know, over the past several years, when we've in our live conferences, we've tried to get corrections union people, and it's been like pulling teeth. Few of them want to appear before journalists. Few of them want to appear in public at all. And Andy is probably the only one that I have seen. There may be a few others around the country.
And the folks from the Rikers Union, the black folks from the Rikers Union, they're about all we've had in
That's
the
right. That's right. So I mean, that is the toughest nut to crack, I think, for us as journalists, to really get you know, behind the stories of what the corrections unions and the correctional staff feel. I mean, you know, many of them the unions themselves have this media image of being conservative, being against reforms in California, for instance. But behind that, those are the easy headlines. Behind that, there's a lot of other stories to tell if we can get them. And I really encourage you guys to do what you can in your own areas to try to do that. So anybody else want to make any closing remarks? I've kept you on longer than we expected to, but I hope you haven't minded.
Can I add to what you said before you sign off? It goes to what Mark was saying. So I think there are a few easier ways to get into prisons and build that correctional relationship. And so one of them is that there has been over the last few years, I don't know what's going on amid COVID, a slight uptick in the number of prisons that have in prison college education programs. They love having their graduation ceremonies covered. I've covered one sort of in the midst of the Second Chance Act that Trump also signed, provided more money for those programs. I don't know what's going to happen in the midst of these budget cuts. The Vera Institute has all of that information of who's running those programs across the country. It's a great way to get into prisons. The corrections officers themselves, I went to a graduation here in Arkansas. The corrections officers are so invested in it, and it became a way for me to start building relationships. So, I mean, that's part of this work as we're trying to bring those voices that are critical to this discussion in it. So just a tossed out story idea.
Thank you, Katti. Mark, any closing words?
I just want to encourage people to not only think about doing solutions journalism, but tell us about it. Tell us when you've done it and submit your stories. And if you have any questions about how to approach criminal justice in this way, I'm always eager to hear from people in the field.
So let me echo that. I will send you all emails over the course of the next few weeks asking you to send us links to any of the stories that you're doing so we can keep everyone else abreast of the good work you're doing and the good ideas. And, feel free to send me emails about your evaluations, what we could do better in these series. This is the close of our COVID and the pandemic series. We just had a youth justice series. We've got a few more coming up over the next several months, and I'll keep you all informed about that. But it's great to see you all, and I really look forward to the stories you produce as a result of it. So,
Steve, can I say something real quick?
Yes, who's that?
Nana?
This is Nana.
Nana, yes.
Yes. So I actually want to say a big thank you to the team. Like I said, it has been a great experience. A month ago, I applied for an MBA program, and I should say a chunk of my essay was based on the pandemic and what I got from the fellowship. And just 2 days ago, I've been admitted to an MBA program at Fordham University. So I just want to share that with the team and say a big thank you. My essay was basically the notes I took from my 2 fellowships with the team, and I'm looking forward to staying in touch.
Thank you, Nana.
Very good.
And, please let us all know by you all have each other's emails because I've been blasting them out to all of you. So whenever you have news like that, please share it with all of us, and I'll try to share it on our conference page. Please keep watch on that. Okay, well, thank you all. Have a good rest of the day and rest of the week, and we'll be back in touch with you. So we will
Thank you.
Thank you all. Take care.
Take care. Go Jets.